The Two Volodyas by Anton Pavlovich Chekhov. I want to drive myself ill sit, by the driver Sofia Lvovna said in a loud voice, "Wait a minute, driver, I'll get up on the box beside you." She stood up in the sledge, and her husband Vladimir Nikitich and the friend of her childhood Vladimir Mihailovich held her arms to prevent her falling. The three horses were galloping fast. "I said you ought not to have given her brandy," Vladimir Nikitich whispered to his companion, with vexation. "What a fellow you are really." The colonel knew by experience that in women like his wife Sofia Lvovna, after a little too much wine, turbulent gaiety was followed by hysterical laughter, and then tears. He was afraid that when they got home, instead of being able to sleep, he would have to be administering compresses and drops. "Whoa," cried Sofia Lvovna, "I want to drive myself." She felt genuinely gay and triumphant. For the last 2 months, ever since her wedding, she had been tortured by the thought that she had married Colonel Yajich from worldly motives, and as it is said, par de pit. But that evening at the restaurant, she had suddenly become convinced that she loved him passionately in spite of his 54 years. He was so slim, agile, supple, he made puns and hummed to the gypsies' tunes so charmingly. Really, the older men were nowadays 1,000 times more interesting than the young. It seemed as though age and youth had changed parts. The colonel was 2 years older than her father. But could there be any importance in that if, honestly speaking, there were infinitely more vitality, go, and freshness in him than in herself, though she was only 23? "Oh, my darling," she thought, "you are wonderful." She had become convinced in the restaurant, too, that not a spark of her old feeling remained for the friend of her childhood Vladimir Mihailovich, or simply Volodya, with whom only the day before she had been madly, miserably in love. She now felt nothing but complete indifference. All that evening he had seemed to her spiritless, torpid, uninteresting, and insignificant, and the sang-froid with which he habitually avoided paying at restaurants on this occasion revolted her, and she had hardly been able to resist saying, "If you are poor you should stay at home." The colonel paid for all. Perhaps because trees, telegraph posts, and drifts of snow kept flitting past her eyes, all sorts of disconnected ideas came rushing into her mind. She reflected the bill at the restaurant had been 120 rubles, and 100 had gone to the gypsies, and tomorrow she could fling away 1,000 rubles if she liked, and only 2 months ago, before her wedding, she had not had 3 rubles of her own, and had to ask her father for every trifle. What a change in her life! Her thoughts were in a tangle. She recalled how, when she was a child of 10, Colonel Yajich, now her husband, used to make love to her aunt, and everyone in the house said that he had ruined her, and her aunt had in fact often come down to dinner with her eyes red from crying, and was always going off somewhere, and people used to say of her that the poor thing could find no peace anywhere. He had been very handsome in those days, and had an extraordinary reputation as a lady killer, so much so that he was known all over the town, and it was said of him that he paid a round of visits to his adorers every day, like a doctor visiting his patients, and even now, in spite of his gray hair, his wrinkles, and his spectacles, his thin face looked handsome, especially in profile. Sofia Lvovna's father was an army doctor, and had at one time served in the same regiment with Colonel Yajich. Volodya's father was an army doctor too, and he too had once been in the same regiment as her father and Colonel Yajich, in spite of many amatory adventures, often very complicated and disturbing. Volodya had done splendidly at the university and had taken a very good degree. Now he was specializing in foreign literature and was said to be writing a thesis. He lived with his father, the army doctor, in the barracks, and had no means of his own, though he was 30 as children Sofia, and he had lived under the same roof, though in different flats. He often came to play with her, and they had dancing and French lessons together. But when he grew up into a graceful, remarkably handsome young man, she began to feel shy of him, and then fell madly in love with him, and had loved him right up to the time when she was married to Yajich. He, too, had been renowned for his success with women almost from the age of 14, and the ladies who deceived their husbands on his account excused themselves by saying that he was only a boy. Someone had told a story of him lately, that when he was a student living in lodgings, so as to be near the university, it always happened, if one knocked at his door that one heard his footstep and then a whispered apology. Pardon G. Ni sways pa settle. Yajich was delighted with him and blessed him as a worthy successor, as Derchavin blessed Pushkin. He appeared to be fond of him. They would play billiards or picket by the hour together without uttering a word. If Yajich drove out on any expedition, he always took Volodia with him, and Yajich was the only person Volodia initiated into the mysteries of his thesis. In earlier days, when Yajich was rather younger, they had often been in the position of rivals, but they had never been jealous of one another. In the circle in which they moved, Yajich was nicknamed Big Volodia, and his friend Little Volodia. Besides Big Volodia, Little Volodia, and Sofia Lvovna, there was a fourth person in the sledge, Margarita Alexandrovna, or as everyone called her, Rita, a cousin of Madame Yajicha, very pale girl, over 30, with black eyebrows and a pince-nez, who was forever smoking cigarettes, even in the bitterest frost, and who always had her knees and the front of her blouse covered with cigarette ash. She spoke through her nose, drawling. Every word was of a cold temperament, could drink any amount of wine and liquor without being drunk, and used to tell scandalous anecdotes in a languid and tasteless way at home. She spent her days reading thick magazines, covering them with cigarette ash, or eating frozen apples. "Sonia, give over fooling," she said, drawling. "It's really silly." As they drew near the city gates, they went more slowly and began to pass people and houses. Sofia Lvovna subsided, nestled up to her husband, and gave herself up to her thoughts. Little Volodia sat opposite. By now her light-hearted and cheerful thoughts were mingled with gloomy ones. She thought that the man sitting opposite knew that she loved him, and no doubt he believed the gossip that she married the Colonel Par de Pitt. She had never told him of her love. She had not wanted him to know, and had done her best to hide her feeling, but from her face she knew that he understood her perfectly, and her pride suffered. But what was most humiliating in her position was that since her wedding, Volodia had suddenly begun to pay her attention, which he had never done before, spending hours with her, sitting silent or chattering about trifles. And even now in the sledge, though he did not talk to her, he touched her foot with his and pressed her hand a little. Evidently, that was all he wanted, that she should be married, and it was evident that he despised her, and that she only excited in him an interest of a special kind, as though she were an immoral and disreputable woman. And when the feeling of triumph and love for her husband were mingled in her soul with humiliation and wounded pride, she was overcome by a spirit of defiance, and longed to sit on the box, to shout and whistle to the horses. Just as they passed the nunnery, the huge 100-ton bell rang out. Rita crossed herself. "Our Olga is in that nunnery," said Sofia Lvovna, and she too crossed herself and shuddered. "Why did she go into the nunnery?" said the colonel. "Par de Pitt," Rita answered crossly, with obvious allusion to Sofia's marrying Yajich. "Par de Pitt is all the fashion nowadays." Defiance of all the world, she was always laughing, a desperate flirt, fond of nothing but balls and young men, and all of a sudden off she went to surprise everyone. "That's not true," said Volodia, turning down the collar of his fur coat and showing his handsome face. "It wasn't a case of Par de Pitt. It was simply horrible. If you like, her brother Dmitri was sent to penal servitude, and they don't know where he is now, and her mother died of grief." He turned up his collar again. "Olga did well," he added in a muffled voice, "living as an adopted child, and with such a paragon as Sofia Lvovna must take that into consideration too." Sofia Lvovna heard a tone of contempt in his voice and longed to say something rude to him, but she said nothing. The spirit of defiance came over her again. She stood up again and shouted in a tearful voice, "I want to go to the early service. Driver, back. I want to see Olga." They turned back. The nunnery bell had a deep note, and Sofia Lvovna fancied there was something in it that reminded her of Olga and her life. The other church bells began ringing too. When the driver stopped the horses, Sofia Lvovna jumped out of the sledge and, unescorted and alone, went quickly up to the gate. "Make haste, please," her husband called to her. "It's late already." She went in at the dark gateway, then by the avenue that led from the gate to the chief church. The snow crunched under her feet, and the ringing was just above her head. and seemed to vibrate through her whole being. Here was the church door, then 3 steps down, and an anteroom with icons of the saints on both sides, a fragrance of juniper and incense, another door, and a dark figure opening it, and bowing very low. The service had not yet begun. One nun was walking by the icon screen, and lighting the candles on the tall standard candlesticks. Another was lighting the chandelier here and there by the columns and the side chapels. There stood black, motionless figures. I suppose they must remain standing as they are now, till the morning, thought Sofya Lvovna, and it seemed to her dark, cold, and drearier than a graveyard. She looked with a feeling of dreariness at the still motionless figures, and suddenly felt a pang at her heart for some reason. In one short nun with thin shoulders and a black kerchief on her head, she recognized Olga, though when Olga went into the nunnery, she had been plump, and had looked taller. Hesitating and extremely agitated, Sofya Lvovna went up to the nun, and looking over her shoulder into her face, recognized her as Olga. "Olga," she cried, throwing up her hands, and could not speak from emotion. "Olga." The nun knew her at once. She raised her eyebrows in surprise, and her pale, freshly washed face, and even, it seemed, the white headcloth that she wore under her wimple, beamed with pleasure. "What a miracle from God," she said, and she too threw up her thin, pale little hands. Sofya Lvovna hugged her and kissed her warmly, and was afraid, as she did so, that she might smell of spirits. "We were just driving past, and we thought of you," she said, breathing hard, as though she had been running. "Dear me, how pale you are. I am very glad to see you well. Tell me, how are you? Are you dull?" Sofya Lvovna looked round at the other nuns, and went on in a subdued voice. "There have been so many changes at home. You know I am married to Colonel Yajich. You remember him, no doubt. I am very happy with him." "Well, thank God for that. And is your father quite well?" "Yes, he is quite well. He often speaks of you. You must come and see us during the holidays. Olga want you." "I will come," said Olga, and she smiled ill. "Come on the second day." Sofya Lvovna began crying. She did not know why, and for a minute she shed tears in silence. Then she wiped her eyes and said, "Rita will be very sorry not to have seen you. She is with us too. And Volodyas here, they are close to the gate. How pleased they'd be if you'd come out and see them. Let's go out to them. The service hasn't begun yet." "Let us," Olga agreed. She crossed herself 3 times and went out with Sofya Lvovna to the entrance. "So you say you're a happy Sonechka?" she asked when they came out at the gate. "Very. Well, thank God for that." The 2 Volodyas, seeing the nun, got out of the sledge and greeted her respectfully. Both were visibly touched by her pale face and her black monastic dress, and both were pleased that she had remembered them and come to greet them, that she might not be cold. Sofya Lvovna wrapped her up in a rug and put one half of her fur coat round her. Her tears had relieved and purified her heart, and she was glad that this noisy, restless, and in reality impure night should unexpectedly end so purely and serenely. And to keep Olga by her a little longer, she suggested, "Let us take her for a drive. Get in, Olga. Well, go a little way." The men expected the nun to refuse. Saints don't dash about in 3-horse sledges, but to their surprise she consented and got into the sledge, and while the horses were galloping to the city gate, all were silent and only tried to make her warm and comfortable, and each of them was thinking of what she had been in the past, and what she was now. Her face was now passionless, inexpressive, cold, pale, and transparent, as though there were water, not blood, in her veins. And 2 or 3 years ago she had been plump and rosy, talking about her suitors and laughing at every trifle. Near the city gate the sledge turned back. When it stopped 10 minutes later, near the nunnery, Olga got out of the sledge. The bell had begun to ring more rapidly. "The Lord save you," said Olga, and she bowed low as nuns do. "Mind you come, Olga." I will." She went and quickly disappeared through the gateway, and when after that they drove on again, Sofya Lvovna felt very sad. Everyone was silent. She felt dispirited and weak all over. That she should have made a nun get into a sledge and drive in a company hardly sober seemed to her now stupid, tactless, and almost sacrilegious. as the intoxication passed off the desire to deceive herself. Passed away also, it was clear to her now that she did not love her husband and never could love him, and that it all had been foolishness and nonsense. She had married him from interested motives, because, in the words of her school friends, he was madly rich, and because she was afraid of becoming an old maid like Rita, and because she was sick of her father the doctor and wanted to annoy Volodia. If she could have imagined when she got married that it would be so oppressive, so dreadful, and so hideous, she would not have consented to the marriage for all the wealth in the world. But now there was no setting it right, she must make up her mind to it. They reached home, getting into her warm, soft bed, and pulling the bedclothes over her. Sofia Lvovna recalled the dark church, the smell of incense, and the figures by the columns, and she felt frightened at the thought that these figures would be standing there all the while she was asleep. The early service would be very, very long, then there would be the hours, then the Mass, then the service of the day. But of course there is a God, there certainly is a God, and I shall have to die, so that sooner or later one must think of one's soul, of eternal life, like Olga. Olga is saved. Now she has settled all questions for herself. But if there is no God, then her life is wasted. But how is it wasted? Why is it wasted? And a minute later, the thought came into her mind again. There is a God, death must come, one must think of one's soul. If Olga were to see death before her this minute, she would not be afraid, she is prepared. And the great thing is that she has already solved the problem of life for herself. There is a God, yes, but is there no other solution except going into a monastery? To go into the monastery means to renounce life, to spoil it. Sofia Lvovna began to feel rather frightened. She hid her head under her pillow. I mustn't think about it, she whispered, I mustn't. Yajich was walking about on the carpet in the next room with a soft jingle of spurs, thinking about something. The thought occurred to Sofia Lvovna that this man was near and dear to her only for one reason, that his name too was Vladimir. She sat up in bed and called tenderly, Volodia. What is it? Her husband responded. Nothing. She lay down again. She heard a bell, perhaps the same nunnery bell. Again she thought of the vestibule, and the dark figures, and thoughts of God and of inevitable death strayed through her mind, and she covered her ears that she might not hear the bell. She thought that before old age and death there would be a long, long life before her, and that day by day she would have to put up with being close to a man she did not love, who had just now come into the bedroom and was getting into bed, and would have to stifle in her heart her hopeless love for the other young, fascinating, and as she thought, exceptional man. She looked at her husband and tried to say good night to him, but suddenly burst out crying. Instead, she was vexed with herself. Well, now then, for the music, said Yajich. She was not pacified till 10 o'clock in the morning. She left off crying and trembling all over, but she began to have a splitting headache. Yajich was in haste to go to the late Mass, and in the next room was grumbling at his orderly, who was helping him to dress. He came into the bedroom once with the soft jingle of his spurs to fetch something, and then a second time wearing his epaulets and his orders on his breast, limping slightly from rheumatism, and it struck Sofia Lvovna that he looked and walked like a bird of prey. She heard Yajich ring the telephone bell. Be so good as to put me on to the Vasilevsky barracks, he said, and a minute later, Vasilevsky barracks, please ask Dr. Salimovich to come to the telephone, and a minute later, with whom am I speaking? Is it you, Volodia? Delighted. Ask your father to come to us at once, dear boy. My wife is rather shattered after yesterday. Not at home, you say? Thank you, very good. I shall be much obliged, merci. Yajich came into the bedroom for the third time, bent down to his wife, made the sign of the cross over her, gave her his hand to kiss. The women who had been in love with him used to kiss his hand, and he had got into the habit of it, and saying that he should be back to dinner, went out. At 12 o'clock, the maid came in to announce that Vladimir Mihailovich had arrived. Sofia Lvovna, staggering with fatigue and headache, hurriedly put on her marvelous new lilac dressing gown trimmed with fur, and hastily did up her hair after a fashion. She was conscious of an inexpressible tenderness in her heart, and was trembling with joy, and with fear that he might go away. She wanted nothing but to look at him. Volodia came dressed correctly for calling, in a swallowtail coat and white tie, When Sofia Lvovna came in, he kissed her hand and expressed his genuine regret that she was Roman 99. Then, when they had sat down, he admired her dressing gown. "I was upset by seeing Olga yesterday," she said. "At first I felt it dreadful, but now I envy her. She is like a rock that cannot be shattered. There is no moving her." But was there no other solution for her? Volodia, is burying oneself alive the only solution of the problem of life? Why, it's death, not life. At the thought of Olga, Volodia's face softened. "Here you are, a clever man," Volodia said. "Sofia Lvovna, show me how to do what Olga has done. Of course, I am not a believer and should not go into a nunnery, but one can do something equivalent. Life isn't easy for me," she added, after a brief pause. "Tell me what to do. Tell me something I can believe in. Tell me something, if it's only one word." "One word, by all means, Tarabumdia." "Volodia, why do you despise me?" she asked hotly. "You talk to me in a special fatuous way. If you'll excuse me, not as one talks to one's friends and women one respects. You are so good at your work, you are fond of science. Why do you never talk of it to me? Why is it, am I not good enough?" Volodia frowned with annoyance and said, "Why do you want science all of a sudden? Don't you perhaps want constitutional government or sturgeon and horseradish?" "Very well, I am a worthless, trivial, silly woman with no convictions. I have a mass of defects. I am neurotic, corrupt, and I ought to be despised for it. But you, Volodia, are 10 years older than I am, and my husband is 30 years older. I've grown up before your eyes. And if you would, you could have made anything you liked of me, angel. But yow," her voice quivered, "treat me horribly. Yajich has married me in his old age, and you—" "Come, come," said Volodia, sitting nearer her and kissing both her hands. "Let the Schopenhauers philosophize and prove whatever they like, while well kiss these little hands. You despise me, and if only you knew how miserable it makes me," she said uncertainly, knowing beforehand that he would not believe her. "And if you only knew how I want to change, to begin another life. I think of it with enthusiasm, and tears of enthusiasm actually came into her eyes. To be good, honest, pure, not to be lying, to have an object in life." "Come, come, come, please, don't be affected. I don't like it," said Volodia, and an ill-humored expression came into his face. "Upon my word, you might be on the stage. Let us behave like simple people." To prevent him from getting cross and going away, she began defending herself and forced herself to smile to please him, and again she began talking of Olga and of how she longed to solve the problem of her life and to become something real. "Tarabumdia," he hummed, "Tarabumdia." And all at once, he put his arm round her waist, while she, without knowing what she was doing, laid her hands on his shoulders, and for a minute gazed with ecstasy, almost intoxication, at his clever, ironical face, his brow, his eyes, his handsome beard. "You have known that I love you for ever so long," she confessed to him, and she blushed painfully and felt that her lips were twitching with shame. "I love you. Why do you torture me?" She shut her eyes and kissed him passionately on the lips, and for a long while, a full minute, could not take her lips away, though she knew it was unseemly, that he might be thinking the worse of her, that a servant might come in. "Oh, how you torture me," she repeated. When half an hour later, having got all that he wanted, he was sitting at lunch in the dining room, she was kneeling before him, gazing greedily into his face, and he told her that she was like a little dog waiting for a bit of ham to be thrown to it. Then he sat her on his knee, and dancing her up and down, like a child, hummed, "Tarabumdia, Tarabumdia," and when he was getting ready to go, she asked him in a passionate whisper, "When today, where?" and held out both hands to his mouth, as though she wanted to seize his answer in them. "Today it will hardly be convenient," he said, after a minute's thought. "Tomorrow, perhaps." And they parted before dinner. Sofia Lvovna went to the nunnery to see Olga, but there she was told that Olga was reading the Psalter somewhere over the dead. From the nunnery, she went to her father's, and found that he too was out. Then she took another sledge, and drove aimlessly about the streets till evening, and for some reason, she kept thinking of the aunt whose eyes were red with crying, and who could find no peace anywhere. And at night they drove out again with 3 horses to a restaurant out of town, and listened to the gypsies, and driving back past the nunnery again, Sofia Lvovna thought of Olga, and she felt aghast at the thought that for the girls and women of her class there was no solution but to go on driving about and telling lies or going into a nunnery to mortify the flesh. And next day she met her lover, and again Sofia Lvovna drove about the town alone in a hired sledge thinking about her aunt. A week later Volodia threw her over, and after that life went on, as before, uninteresting, miserable, and sometimes even agonizing. The Colonel and Volodia spent hours playing billiards, and Picket Rita told anecdotes in the same languid, tasteless way, and Sofia Lvovna went about alone in hired sledges and kept begging her husband to take her for a good drive with 3 horses. Going almost every day to the nunnery, she wearied Olga, complaining of her unbearable misery, weeping, and feeling as she did so that she brought with her into the cell something impure, pitiful, shabby. And Olga repeated to her mechanically, as though a lesson learnt by rote, that all this was of no consequence, that it would all pass and God would forgive her.